On someone's very first day in a new job, in a new country, a longtime employee named Carlos walked into the office and said something that would stick with the new arrival for years afterward. He said, essentially, I've worked at this company, in this location, for 15 years. I know the business. I know everyone, and everyone knows me. I know the country, I speak the language. I really wanted this job. And yet they gave it to you. You don't know the country. You don't speak the language. So why did they give this job to you? That question, blunt, uncomfortable, and completely fair, sits at the heart of a small, sharp business book called The 80/20th CFO, written by two experienced finance executives, Janice Berthold and Susie Tahirian, structured as a candid, back-and-forth conversation between the two of them. The book isn't a dense academic treatise on corporate finance. It's something more useful for the person actually living the job, a set of hard-won, practical answers to the exact question Carlos asked. Why are you here? What are you supposed to actually do? And how do you prove it fast enough to earn the trust of people who owe you nothing? Because here's the strange truth about being a chief financial officer that the book keeps circling back to: there often isn't a real job description. The unofficial one usually sounds something like, make the CEO look good and help the company succeed, which sounds nice and tells you almost nothing about what to actually do on a Monday morning. This book exists to fill that gap. Let's walk through it, chapter by chapter, the way Jan and Susie built it. Part 1. The loneliest seat in the room. Before getting into tactics, the book makes a point of naming something most executives don't say out loud. The CFO role is, by design, one of the loneliest positions in the entire company. This isn't an accident or a flaw in how companies are structured. It's baked into the job on purpose. The CFO is meant to function as a counterbalance inside the organization, someone who has to say no to a favorite project, question an optimistic sales forecast, or flag a risk nobody else in the room wants to hear about. In some sense, the CFO is both the steward of the company's resources and its internal police, which naturally puts the role in tension with other executives who are incentivized to move fast, spend confidently, and paint the rosiest possible picture. Understanding this upfront matters because a new CFO who doesn't expect this friction can mistake it for personal conflict, when really it's just the structural shape of the job. Once you accept that some tension is simply part of the role, you stop taking it personally, and you can start building the relationships and credibility that make the tension productive instead of corrosive. Part 2. The first 90 days. This is where the book spends real energy, because both authors agree the first 90 days in a new CFO role are disproportionately important. Whatever trust and credibility gets built or fails to get built in that window tends to shape how much room you have to operate for years afterward. The advice here isn't about doing everything at once. It's about being deliberate and visible. Early on, a new CFO needs a genuine, honest read on the company's financial and risk situation, not the version presented in the polished board deck, but the real picture, gathered by asking direct questions and looking closely at the numbers yourself. Alongside that, the book pushes hard on quick wins, identifiable, visible improvements you can deliver early, things that demonstrate competence and follow through before people have had time to fully trust you on reputation alone. The logic connects directly back to that opening story with Carlos. Every new CFO walks into a room full of people quietly asking some version of his question. Why does this person deserve to be here? And what are they actually going to do for us? The way you answer that question isn't with a speech. It's by getting a clear-eyed assessment of the company's risks within your first months, delivering a handful of concrete, visible wins, and letting people watch you follow through on what you said you'd do. Milestones hit as promised, again and again, are what quietly build the kind of trust that speeches never can. Part 3. Helping the board become an effective coach. One of the more counterintuitive ideas in the book concerns the board of directors, not just reporting to them, but actively helping shape how effectively they function as advisors and overseers. Many new CFOs treat the board purely as an audience to be managed, a group to present numbers to, reassure, and get through smoothly each quarter. The book pushes for something more collaborative. A board that only receives polished updates can't actually coach or challenge the executive team in a meaningful way because they're never shown the real texture of the business, the open questions, the trade-offs, the places where reasonable people might disagree. Helping the board be an effective coach means bringing them real issues, not just resolved ones. It means being transparent about where things are uncertain, so their experience and outside perspective can genuinely add value instead of simply rubber-stamping decisions after the fact. This requires some vulnerability from a new CFO. Admitting uncertainty to the people evaluating your performance can feel risky, but the book's position is that boards who are treated as genuine thinking partners end up providing far more value and far more air cover than boards who are simply managed and placated. Part 4. Inspiring the talent on your team. A CFO's effectiveness rarely comes purely from their own individual brilliance with numbers. It comes from the team underneath them, and this chapter focuses on how to actually build a finance function people want to be part of, rather than one people merely tolerate. Finance teams often carry a reputation, fair or not, for being the department that says no, that slows things down, that exists to catch mistakes rather than enable growth. The book argues that a CFO who wants a genuinely strong team has to actively push back against that reputation internally, helping finance staff see themselves as strategic partners to the rest of the business, not just scorekeepers and gatekeepers. Practically, this means investing real time in developing people, giving them exposure to strategic conversations beyond their narrow function, and being explicit about how their work connects to the company's bigger goals. Talented finance professionals, like talented people in any function, want to feel like their work matters beyond the mechanics of closing the books each month. A CFO who takes the time to make that connection visible tends to retain stronger talent and build a team that other departments actually want to collaborate with, rather than one they merely have to comply with. Part 5. Getting comfortable with the financials. This might sound like an odd chapter for a finance book. Surely a CFO is already comfortable with financial statements? But the book makes an important distinction here. Being comfortable with the specific financials of a new, unfamiliar company is a different skill from generally understanding accounting and finance. Every company has its own quirks, its own chart of accounts, its own historical accounting choices, its own way certain costs get categorized, its own legacy systems and reporting processes that may not match textbook best practice. A new CFO walking in with strong technical finance skills still has to spend real, deliberate time getting genuinely fluent in this specific company's numbers, understanding not just what the reports say, but why they're structured the way they are, and where the historical quirks and blind spots might be hiding. The book frames this as foundational to everything else in the role. You can't credibly drive change, negotiate with a board, or advise a CEO on strategy if you don't yet have a rock-solid, detailed grasp of your own company's financial reality. Skipping this step, or rushing through it in the interest of looking decisive early, tends to backfire later, when gaps in understanding surface at the worst possible moment. Part 6. Initiating change in your organization. Once the groundwork of trust and financial fluency is in place, the book turns to what many CFOs are ultimately brought in to do: drive meaningful change, whether that's cost discipline, new financial systems, restructured processes, or a broader strategic pivot. The authors are candid that technical correctness alone rarely wins the day here. A CFO can identify exactly the right financial or operational change to make and still fail to get it implemented if the human and organizational side of change management gets ignored. This chapter emphasizes building genuine buy-in before rolling out major changes, bringing key stakeholders into the reasoning early, rather than presenting them with a finished plan and hoping for compliance. There's also a recurring theme about pacing. Move too fast, without enough groundwork, and you risk a backlash that undermines the very credibility you spent your first 90 days building. Move too slowly, and you risk being seen as ineffective, brought in to change things but unable or unwilling to actually do it. Finding the right cadence, informed by how much trust and momentum you've already built, is treated as much an art as a science. Part 7. Successful fundraising. For CFOs at companies that need external capital, whether through debt, equity, or other financing arrangements, this chapter turns to the practical realities of raising money credibly. The book frames fundraising less as a one-time event and more as an extension of the same credibility-building work that runs through the whole book. Investors and lenders, like boards and internal teams, are ultimately being asked to trust a story about the company's future, backed by a CFO's credibility in presenting it honestly and confidently. A CFO who has done the work of genuinely understanding the company's financial reality and who has a track record of transparent, accurate communication internally tends to be far more effective at making that same case externally. Practical advice here touches on preparation, knowing your numbers cold, anticipating the tough questions investors will ask, and being ready with a clear, honest narrative about both the opportunities and the risks ahead, rather than a purely rosy pitch that experienced investors will see through immediately. Part 8. Creating and maintaining a partnership with the CEO. If there's one relationship the book treats as make or break for a CFO's success, it's the relationship with the CEO. The authors describe it almost like a marriage, a partnership that has to be built deliberately, maintained through consistent communication, and repaired quickly when friction arises, because the whole organization tends to notice and react to how well or poorly that relationship is functioning. The CFO occupies an unusual position relative to the CEO, someone the CEO must fundamentally trust, since the CFO often signs contracts, manages capital, and has visibility into nearly every part of the business, while also being the person most likely to challenge the CEO's assumptions or flag reasons a favored initiative might not work. Holding both of those roles at once, trusted partner and honest challenger, requires exceptionally frequent, direct communication. The book advocates for frequent check-ins framed almost conversationally, flagging what you're doing, checking whether the CEO is aligned, surfacing concerns as they arise rather than saving them up for a formal quarterly review. This kind of ongoing, low-friction communication is what allows a CEO to feel confident that the CFO has their back, even in moments of disagreement, because the relationship has enough of a track record of honesty that a single hard conversation doesn't threaten the whole partnership. Part 9. Selling and Leading Change. This chapter builds directly on the earlier discussion of initiating change, but focuses specifically on the leadership and persuasion skills required to actually sell a change internally, rather than simply design it well on paper. The distinction matters because a technically sound plan and a successfully adopted plan are not the same thing. Selling change means understanding what different stakeholders across the organization actually care about and framing the change in terms that connect to those concerns, rather than purely in terms of financial logic that may feel abstract or threatening to people outside the finance function. Leading change, meanwhile, involves modeling the behavior you're asking others to adopt, staying visible and available throughout a transition rather than delegating the hard conversations entirely, and being willing to adjust the approach based on feedback without abandoning the underlying goal. The book treats this as one of the more underrated CFO skills, the ability to combine rigorous financial reasoning with genuine, patient people leadership. Part 10. Working internationally. Given both authors' own experience working across different countries and cultures, This chapter draws directly on real, lived experience navigating finance leadership roles outside one's home country. Situations exactly like the one that opened with Carlos's pointed question. Working internationally as a CFO means operating with real humility about what you don't know, the local language, the specific regulatory environment, the informal relationships and reputations that took local colleagues years to build. The book argues that acknowledging this gap honestly, rather than trying to bluff competence you don't have, tends to earn more respect from local teams than pretending otherwise. At the same time, an international CFO does bring something distinct to the table, an outside perspective, technical financial expertise, and often direct relationships with headquarters, banking partners, or investors, which can be genuinely valuable precisely because they're different from what an experienced local hire would bring. The chapter's underlying message circles back to the Carlos question directly. A new CFO's value often isn't about matching what an insider already has. It's about complementing it with a different, equally necessary set of skills and perspective. Part 11. Quantifying and Reducing Your Risk. Risk management runs as a thread through nearly the entire book, but this chapter tackles it head-on. The core idea is straightforward but often neglected in practice. A CFO can't manage risks they haven't clearly identified and measured. The chapter pushes for treating risk assessment as an active, ongoing discipline rather than a box checked once a year for compliance purposes. This connects back to the earlier discussion of the first 90 days. Getting a clear, honest read on the company's risk exposure early is repeatedly described as one of the fastest ways for a new CFO to demonstrate value and earn credibility, because it surfaces problems the organization may not have fully confronted and positions the CFO as someone actively protecting the company rather than merely reporting on it after the fact. Part 12. The Risk Management Assessment. The book closes its practical guidance with a more structured look at how to actually conduct a risk management assessment, walking through the kind of systematic exercise a CFO can lead to catalog major risks facing the business, evaluate how likely and how severe each one is, and identify what's already being done, or should be done, to mitigate them. This isn't meant as an abstract academic exercise. The authors frame it as one of the most concrete, high-leverage tools a new CFO has available, precisely because it produces something visible and useful almost immediately, a clear-eyed map of where the company is exposed. That can be shared with the board, the CEO, and other stakeholders as tangible evidence that the new CFO is doing exactly what they were hired to do: protect and strengthen the business, methodically and transparently, from day one. Closing reflection. Underneath every chapter of this book sits the same quiet challenge that Carlos posed on day one: prove why you belong in the seat. Not through credentials alone, not through a polished first impression, but through a specific, deliberate sequence, understanding the real financial picture, building genuine partnerships with the board and the CEO, developing the people around you, driving change with both technical rigor and human patience, and treating risk as something to be actively managed rather than passively reported. None of it happens instantly, and none of it happens by accident. It happens through the compounding effect of small, visible, honest wins, delivered again and again, until the people around you stop asking why you're in the room and start simply relying on the fact that you are.